Welcome everybody, Class 2020. Of course, we wished we could have done it live at some beautiful location somewhere in Latin America, but I gotta say, I'm pretty excited about this format as well. So welcome to Class 22 Digital, and I think the message I got today is pretty exciting, and I hope I can address that in this next 45 minutes to an hour. And the message is about soft lens fitting. Soft lens fitting, it's all its aspects, doesn't necessarily get the credits and the time that it deserves, maybe. But we're at a special time right now in 2020, and I'll explain to you why that is. And I think this is the time to relook at soft lens fitting in 2020 and maybe redo it in a way that we can say soft lens fitting 2.0 is the new way to go. And the reason why I'm saying that is that, and before I go on, these are a couple of my disclosures right here. I've lectured for many companies in the past, but none in particular. And I'm not on anyone's payroll, so I'm free to say whatever I want. But like I said, it's a special time, 2020. And the reason for that is this man, Otto Wichterle from the Czech Republic. And he was the one, together with his colleague Edward Lim, who sort of invented soft lenses 50 years ago. You see him working as a chemist, which he was, and then actually 60 years ago, exactly 60 years ago, he created this instrument with some tools from his kid's Mercure set, which is sort of a mechanical set, and a bicycle dynamo. He made an apparatus to make the very first soft lenses, obviously at that point in a very experimental stage. The first publication on soft lens fitting soft lenses is about 60 years old, but it took about 10 years before the first lenses actually were produced. And this is a table I wanted to show you from January 1st, 1969. And what we see in this table here in the back, it's the original that is still available in the British Optical Museum. We see in this table a couple of things with the first soft lenses ever made. And what is surprising maybe to some is that these lenses were listed in sagittal height. The S and S1 that we see here in the table are the sagittal height values of these soft lenses in millimeters. Now, we're talking 1969. And 1969 is a very special year for many reasons. The summer of 69 is sort of, very, very special atmosphere it created. And I was born in the summer of 69, so for me 1969 is a special year, but for the contact lens industry it was a game changer as the first lenses were created, and these first lenses were marked in sagittal height. Now let's look at soft lens fitting 50 years down the road. Where are we today? And it's interesting, if you look at the amount of lens fits done around the world, and this is the data from Phil Morgan's Eurolens survey, you see that the bulk of the lenses, about 80 to 90%, is with soft lenses in different parts of the world. So roughly 10 to 15% is with rigid lenses, corneal GPs as we call them today, and then there's a couple of percentage for ortho K, which is marked in respectively the red and the orange here in the graph. But the bulk obviously is in soft lenses, and it's funny that if you go to meetings like Global Specialty Lens Symposium, many of you I've seen in the past, or I hope to see in the future there. It's every year in Las Vegas. The bulk of the lectures is on scleral lenses, ortho-K, corneal topography and corneal GP lenses. And more soft lenses are playing a role in that and should play a role in that. So we have an important responsibility, I guess, towards that 90% roughly of lens fits around the world that doesn't always get the attention that it deserves. Now, we wrote an article a little while back based on one of these global specialty lens symposia, and it said it's not as simple as ABC. And we got together with a bunch of educators from around the world looking at soft lens fitting. And one of the things we realized is that currently we're not actually fitting soft lenses. At best, we are trying to find eyes basically that best conform to our limited arsenal of soft lenses that we have on the shelf. And if we could just turn that around and say, listen, let's measure that eye, see what that shape is, and to find or design a lens best suitable for that eye. That would be the future. That would be soft lens fitting 2.0. And that's what I'm trying to do here today, and what we'll try to do in this particular presentation, to look at the options for soft lens fitting 2.0. Now, if you look at the current literature, this is a beautiful paper that you see here, one by Graham Young and the other one by Fiona Stapleton. It's a review paper, and in that review paper, it is stated that both base curve and diameter are surrogate measures for lens sag. So circling back to that original chart on soft lens fitting by Otto Wichterle, we may need to take a little bit of a better look at sagittal height values rather than base curve and diameter to identify and to fit our soft lenses. And if you look at the module of the World's Institute, which is the International Association for Contact Lens Educators, it's actually in their soft lens module to think about sagittal height when fitting soft lenses. And there's basically two rules we have to keep in mind. It's not that complicated actually. And rule number one is that if you keep the diameter the same and you go steeper on a given lens, your sagittal height is going to increase. And the opposite is true as well. So if you're going to go flatter, keeping the diameter the same, your sagittal height is going to be shallower, lower, and the lens will be flatter. And the opposite is true as well. So rule number two is if you keep the base curve the same of the lens, assuming that it's just one base curve, if you go smaller, then the sagittal height of that lens will decrease. And if you go bigger, the sagittal height of that lens will increase quite dramatically. Our studies have shown that the effect of base curve, going from an 8.3 to an 8.7, is maybe somewhere in the 300 micron range. Now, for our own understanding, a micron is 1,000th of a millimeter, and the cornea is about what, 500 microns thick. So just to put things in perspective. So if you go from an 8.3 to an 8.7, we're looking at about 300 microns. If you change the diameter of a lens by 1 millimeter from 14 to 15, all of a sudden we're looking at 6, 7, 8, 900 microns of difference, depending on the base curve of the lens that you're working with. So in essence, quite a dramatic step. And in essence, if you want to take a parameter out of these two, then you'd rather take diameter over base curve actually. Interestingly, in the last 10 years or so, we've learned a lot about the shape of the ocular surface beyond the cornea, beyond the limits on the sclera. And most of that stems from scleral lens research. And in scleral lens research, we also started to think in sagittal height. By the way, some also use the term sagittal depth when it comes to lenses, and then sagittal height when it comes to the ocular surface. With our consensus group, we agreed or said that maybe we should make it sagittal height for everything, just to prevent any form of confusion. And when we talk about the ocular surface, we're talking about the OC sag, ocular surface sagittal height. When we talk about the contact lens, we talk about the CL sag, which is the contact lens sagittal height. Now, going back to the OC sag, ocular surface sagittal height, we know much more about that than we knew 10-15 years ago, again coming from that new instrumentation. And that new instrumentation is not the keratometry. Placido disc corneal topographers and ocular surface topographers learn us a lot about understanding on the ocular surface over, let's say, a 15mm cord, which is typically the workbench. That is where a soft lens lands on the cornea. Maybe the lens is 14 or 14.2. It moves a little bit, 0.2, 0.3 on either side. So we're looking roughly at 15mm. And based on OCT, originally, we could calculate the overall sagittal height over that 14mm cord on the ocular surface. And even if you have corneal topography only, you can sort of predict what the sagittal height will be over 15mm. And then came newer instruments, profilometry instruments, Scheimpflug instruments. I won't get into detail too much, that's a different lecture, but in essence what they can do is they can measure the entire ocular surface 360 degrees in 50mm cord. And from that you get this, the sagittal height from a base cord to the inside of a contact lens or the outside of the cornea, which is the ocular surface. Now, focusing on the latter, many studies in the past have done that, looked at the ocular surface with different instruments, and you'll see even the Medmont in here, which obviously is not a ocular surface topographer, but a corneal topographer, but it can sort of calculate the sagittal height over a 50mm cord. And what you see from this is that the numbers, the average numbers, are actually surprisingly similar. And even with the newest kits on the block, the Pentacam with a corneal scleral profile add-on, if you want, we measured the same thing, and we came again to numbers that are very comparable to all the others. So that is quite interesting. So if we summarize this part from a clinical perspective, we believe that the average ocular sagittal height over 15mm in the horizontal meridian is about 3,750 micron. So that is a tool that we can that we can work with. Now, question for you. What do you think is the range, the overall range in sagittal height of the normal eye, so we're not talking keratoconus and everything, between the flattest and the steepest, or the lowest and the highest sagittal height in the normal distribution of eyes? Do you think it's in the 500 micron range, thickness of the cornea, or about double of that, about 900 to 1000 micron? Well, again, looking at most of these studies, there's a little bit of variation there, but on average, we're looking at 900 microns. So we know the average, and we know if a patient comes into our practices tomorrow, or even today, while we're doing this online, you know it should be somewhere in that range, 3,750 plus or minus 900 microns. So this is the normal distribution. This is the normal distribution. Like I said, between the flattest and the steepest, there's about 900 micron. So let's take that as a frame, if you want, going forward. So we know a thing or two about the ocular surface, but what do we know about the contact lens sag? What do we know about a contact lens and what it actually looks like? To be honest, not a whole lot. It's limited. So while our workbench, the eye, is getting more and more clearer, On the tools side, our lenses, we have limited access to information. So let's take a look at that. A study that we did in 2015, which is already 5 years ago, on a very limited arsenal of lenses. It was just almost like a trial. We wanted to see what the contact lens sag was with an instrument called the optograph. So what you see in the image here is that actually it gives you an overview of that lens, and we could measure the overall sagittal height. We subtracted the thickness of the lens that we measured, and then you get the posterior contact lens sag of that particular lens. A recent study did something fairly similar, but again, a very limited range of lenses. And what they did, they actually took images with a smartphone, viewed it like we did, and then measured the sagittal height, subtracting the thickness of the lens from the overall sagittal height. Now, interestingly, again, technology is really going to help us out going forward. A new instrument came on the market, not just on the ocular surface, but now on the contact lens side, that can measure sagittal height directly, posterior sagittal height directly, with an instrument that's based on OCT as well. And with that, we actually measured a large cohort of lenses, of 44 lenses, 12 daily disposables, 15 reusables, and 17 toric lenses. And all that work was done at Pacific University together with the people from the IS30 Optomec that I just showed you. So let's take a quick look now at the results of that. So these are all the daily disposable lenses that were included in the study, and I'll give you the results right away. And what is interesting is that you see almost like a linear increase between all these lenses, almost like the companies sat together and said, well, let's all take one of these steps and see what we can do. So we can derive a couple of really interesting things from this data. For one, if I have a lens on the eye that is sort of on the right side of the spectrum back here, and I don't like the lens fit, I think I do want to go, quite a little bit flatter or shallower if you want, then I know now I'm not going to look further to the right. I'm actually going to look on the left, and maybe in the middle or in the extreme left of the graph. That probably gives me a better chance. Now granted, all these lenses have different materials and even lens designs, so it's not just sagittal height. I will come back to that in just a little bit. The best comparison is always between lenses of the same make, in the same design, and the same material. Then you can really talk in steps of sagittal height. But first, let's put things into perspective a little bit. We talked about microns already. We know from scleral lens fitting a lot about microns. So those of you who work with scleral lenses, I don't have to explain anything. But we know the cornea is about 514 micron. Again, just as a perspective, we know we like a clearance of maybe 200 microns. A thickness, center thickness of the scleral lens is typically 250 microns. And to put things even more in perspective, let's keep in mind that the tear film, the human tear film, is actually only 2 to 5 microns thick. So we're putting really big lenses with a lot of thickness, a soft lens is maybe 70 or 80 microns in thickness, on that ocular surface. So that's something to keep in mind, although it's a different story. But now that we know a little bit what we're talking about with microns, so what we see in our batch of lenses within the daily disposable group is that we see, for instance, a couple of lenses that have different companies that have the same base curve. So different lenses, but both have a base curve of 8.5 or 9.0. And look at the differences here between one base curve of 8.5 and the next. And the maximum change we see with an 8.7, we see a 264 micron difference between one 8.7 and the next. So lesson number one from this data is we cannot go by base curve alone. Base curve alone is not a substitute for lens. If you want to do lens substitution, maybe the eye care practitioner or maybe the patient just wants to try a different lens, you cannot go by base curve alone, at least not from a contact lens sag perspective, because these lenses are marked different. 3 lens designs also offer 2 different base curves. So, you know, an AccuView, for instance, with 2 different base curves, and the differences between those lenses were about 300 microns in that daily disposable group. I'll come back to that in a little bit. From a practical perspective, it may be more interesting to look at this one. We created these grids when we plotted on the horizontal and the vertical the same lenses, but now you can see directly if you're going to change from an 8.3 to an 8.7 of the same lens, for instance, what the actual differences are, or if you're going to change from one manufacturer 8.7 to another, what your difference is. So these are hopefully practical tools that you can use in your practice when trying to better fit soft lenses. Now let's take a look at the reusable lenses. So again, we choose the 4 major companies in the US offering these lenses at the time, and we wanted to compare them to each other. And again, look at the beautiful linear line almost that you can draw through it. And now I know if I go from an Air Optics 8.4 to a frequency sleeve, for instance, I know I'm changing that lens by more than 400 microns. So again, it helps us putting things in perspective. Now within this group, there were actually 5 lenses that offered a base curve of 8.6. So 5 different companies offering an 8.6. And the differences were quite marked, sometimes less so. But within 8.6, for instance, the difference was 380 microns maximum. So that is quite substantial actually. And then 5 lenses offered 2 different base curves, and you can see the numbers right there. Now, again, we created that grid, and what is interesting when you want to make a change from one lens to the other, we think, it's not evidence-based, but it's a gut feeling that you need about 250 or 300 microns difference before you can actually see and notice the changes on the eye in the lens assessment, so in movement and centration and all that. So about 40, 39 to be exact, lens combinations within the reusable group had more than 300 microns of difference between them. So that gives us a little bit of ammunition to work with. As far as we know, we're the first ones to actually look at toric lenses as well. Interestingly, the range between the flattest and the steepest lens were not all that different from, for instance, the reusable or the daily disposable lenses. You would maybe expect with toric lenses to have a slightly bigger range because the diameter change is also different, bigger in toric lenses. 4 base curves had an 8.5 with about 350 microns difference maximum between those, and only 1 lens design offered 2 different base curves with a 380 micron difference. And again, we created a grid split into daily disposables and the reusable ones. I'm sorry, it's too small to read, but just to give you an idea of what we're trying to do. And of course, we'll get that available to you. Now, if you've been taking notes and paying attention, this should be an easy one for you. If a certain type of reusable lens has 2 different base curves, what is the average difference between lens A and lens B? Is it about 175 or up to almost 500 microns? Well, I'll give you the answer right away. It's about 275. So here are all the different lenses with the different base curves, and on average is about 275 microns. So what we can learn from this is, yes, it's nice to have 2 base curves because that gives you a little bit of more freedom, a little bit of more tools, but the difference between those lenses is actually limited to some degree. So it's not like you can do the 900 micron range of all lenses. So it's still the top of the bell curve that it serves, potentially bigger. But the lesson here is, the conclusion is that, of course, all major manufacturers trying to fit the top of that bell curve, that is where their focus is. And whether it's one or two lenses, they're still serving that top of the bell curve. Now, one final thing that we did is that we plotted the toric lenses versus the spherical lenses and put that in a grid. So what you can see here is that in clinical practice, what you and I typically do is, if you have a spherical lens and you have an over-refraction, a CIL 0.75, you're going to typically switch from the sphere to the toric version, and without thinking, basically. And if you do that with one design, you may change the lens fit by about 500 microns or more. If you do that with another lens design, you're basically changing nothing. And I'm certainly not trying to judge here. I'm not saying one is better over the other. In general, that was certainly not the purpose of this study. The purpose of this study was just to look at the differences. And I think we should notice as eye care practitioners, if you go from a spherical to a toric, what is happening, and am I going to change the lens fit dramatically? Then I better have a look, and if not, it may be the same as the other one. So again, it's just trying to better understand the soft lenses that we fit.
Miro 1 month delivers one of the highest levels of oxygen transmission, available in sphere, toric and multifocal. Miro 1 month contact lenses from Menicon.
Now, we know a little bit about the ocular sag, we know a little bit about the contact lens sag. Now let's try to combine them, because that's not the whole story. The separate parts, that's not the whole story. We need to combine them. And what we see, if you combine the contact lens sag with an ocular sag, it's like a speed date. You have the guys at one end, the ocular surface, and then you have the girls on the other side, the contact lenses, and you're trying to find a good match, hopefully for life. I'm sure that's the same in Colombia or the Netherlands or anywhere else in the world. Now what you see here is that we match the ocular sag with the contact lens. And I don't know if you can notice that all the way from Amsterdam to Colombia or anywhere else where you're looking in Latin America. But this is not the ideal lens fit. The lens actually goes over the limbus. If you take a still out of that, that's not a very comfortable lens. So we need something in addition to ocular sag to get to the contact lens sag. It's ocular sag plus something. In other words, you need to fit the lens somewhat steeper in order to create a little bit of grip. So let's add 200 microns. We're all familiar with thinking in microns now. So let's take the ocular sag, add 200 and see what that gives us in terms of lens fit. And I've shown this one in different parts of the world, and most people would agree that it's pretty okay what we're looking at. Some people say it's perfect. Others say, yeah, for me it still moves a little bit too much. Well, let's just assume that we had a lens trial set, that we could add another 200 microns. So now we're going to add 400 microns, and we're going to see what that's going to look like. Well, it's going to look like this. Let's see if we can get this person to blink a couple of times. Again, I've shown this picture numerous times, and some people said, yeah, for me that's okay. Others said, yeah, for me that's a little bit tight. Well, you know what? Again, if we had the freedom to order what we wanted, right now we may have ordered a plus 300 in between the 2 and the 400, or maybe depending on your own preference and maybe depending on the patient, you choose for a 200 or whatever. The point here is we are back in charge again over the lens fit, and we've kind of lost that in the last, well, couple of decades basically. Now the million-dollar question is, What is that number? What is the difference between the ocular sag and the contact lens sag? And there is no magic one number. We've done a study in the Netherlands where we came to a figure of 130 microns, but that was just for a number of lenses. And the variation was actually huge. So what it really depends on is the material, the design. Is it a daily disposable or disposable lens in general, or is it the molded lens, or is it a lens that's been late cut, etc., etc. So there's no magic bullet number for all of them. Let's look at it this way. If you would put a soft lens on the eye, and if the soft lens was made of a rigid material, so there was no room for flexure on the eye, then how many lenses you think we would be able to fit on that normal bell curve of eyes? Well, not a whole lot. You would only be able to fit about 1/3 of the eyes in the normal population. Luckily for us and the patients, soft lenses do flex on the eye. And we think the delta sag, the difference between the contact lens sag and the ocular sag, is somewhere in the 100 to 250 micron range. So you need to go steeper by about that, 100 to 250, maybe 300 microns. We're not exactly sure, but somewhere in that range, it's probably what we're looking at. And if you do that, you should be able to fit about 86 to 87% of eyes, depending a little bit on your calculations. So what I'm trying to say here is that with the standard lenses that we have, the lenses that I just showed you, we should be able to fit, let's say 75% roughly of all eyes in the normal population. I'm not talking extraordinary post-surgical eyes and everything. Normal eyes. Also means that 25% fall off the wagon. And that's a responsibility for us to identify those and say, well, listen, we won't be able to fit you with a standard lens. I can try and try and try, you know, the typical try and error, and after 5 lenses, you are tired of it and the patient is tired of it. If we could prevent that, we could prevent dropout in that arena potentially. So again, we're roughly looking at 25%. If your practice happens to be a specialty practice where you get referrals from all over, that number is probably bigger than 25%. Now, I'm a contact lens wearer myself, and every morning when I put my lenses in, I see this air bubble that you see back there. And I'm not that smart a guy, obviously. I never thought about it, but the bubble that you see right there is the delta sag. It's that number between the ocular sag and the contact lens sag of 100 to 250 micron. Of course, after one blink or a couple of blinks, but here is, for instance, after one blink, the bubble is gone, the lens starts to flex. But it's that bubble that is the delta sag. And you may wonder, why isn't it central? Well, I'm a fairly high myope, so the lens is very thin in the middle. So that's where it's going to land first, creating that mid-peripheral bubble that you see. We did some OCT imaging over that lens right after lens application. As you can see right there, you can see the bubble in the image. And then again, after 1 or 2 blinks, the lens flexures and is then stable on the eye. So by default, when you put a soft lens on the eye, there is that flexure. And the question is, where does that force go? Force always have to go somewhere, right? And in terms of soft lenses, there's actually 2 pathways. And the first pathway is outside. In a beautiful written paper by Graham Young in Optometry and Vision Science, go and read it if you like this topic, he calculated the expansion of a soft lens on the eye. So the bigger the difference between the contact lens sag and the ocular sag is, the more expansion there is. And he calculated that in terms of edge strain. Now, a normal edge strain of a normal lens or normal ocular surface is about 3%. So that is our ideal, if you want. If you do that with a 14mm lens, and you put it on the eye, that lens is going to expand from 14 to 14.4, so an increase of 0.4 millimeter. I don't know if that's important clinically, but it's really good to understand soft lens fitting. Now I'm going to turn it up one notch. If you're going to change a lens from an 8.4 to an 8.8, what do you think is going to happen? The lens is going to go flatter. Your delta sag is going to decrease. The difference between the ocular surface and the lens is smaller. So the on-eye diameter actually decreases then by 0.2 millimeter. I know it's kind of hard to understand, but if you got this, you really understand the in-depth soft lens fitting. So it's pretty cool stuff. So force number one is going outside. Every soft lens that you put on the eye will expand. I have to say, with the assumption that the temperature of that lens stays the same, because there is a difference between room temperature and eye temperature, and that influences that whole package. But that aside, let's assume the temperature is the same. This is the effect that's going to happen on the eye, just to explain what's happening. Now that's not the whole story. There's a second force as well. The force that cannot go outside goes inside. And inside is the corneal epithelium. Now if you do a corneal topography before and after soft lens fitting, and you subtract that from each other, just like most of us do with ortho K, you get a difference map. This difference map right here is not an ortho K lens. It's a soft lens fit set to a very sensitive scale. I gotta grant you that. But if you do that, you'll get images like this and this. So typically it's in a circular pattern, meaning that the forces of the soft lens on the corneal epithelium, since the lens of course is typically round, is in a circular pattern as well. And this by now has been established using OCT, looking at the thickness of the epithelium as well. So with this, you may ask, what's the relevance of all the story that I'm trying to tell you? Well, at least we know what's happening. We knew these patterns behind the soft lens were happening, we just had no idea why. It's like these grain circles, they do exist, we don't know where they're coming from. But now with soft lenses, we think we do know where it's coming from. And with modern technology, such as the ESP profilometry, they found the same thing, a marked effect of short-term soft lens wear on even not just the cornea, but also the limbus. So there was a good linear relationship, and the larger the corneal radius, or the flatter the eye, the larger the limbal effect was. So maybe even in the future we can use this to identify whether we have an optimal lens fit or not. But let me try to summarize everything before we close off and make it a little bit more practical, because I agree so far it's been a little bit theoretical. So I think we all agree that we need better tools if we want to keep fitting soft lenses. In a recent editorial for Contact Lens Anterior Eye, together with James Wolfson and Lyndon Jones, the title was, "When was the last time you fitted a soft lens?" So if we want to fit soft lenses, how can we do better than we're doing today? This is a flow chart we developed here in the Netherlands, where I think everything that you need to know is sort of marked. And it all starts with number one, and that is finding Nemo's. And after finding Nemo's, we have to select a lens, and explain to you in just a little bit what I mean with that. And when we select a lens, I think we got to break it up in 3 different categories. We can't just assume all lenses are the same. We got stock lenses, the standard lenses we have on the shelf, out of standard lenses with extended parameters, and then the custom-made lenses. As said, but it starts here. We need to know whether we're in that bell curve of normal eyes or not. Because if we are, we may want to start with a standard lens. And NEMOS, of course, stands for normal eyes measured ocular surfaces. If you have a corneal topographer, or maybe even one of these newer instruments, And even if you don't have a topographer, you could do it with base curve, diameter, and maybe eccentricity. If you have that value, you can sort of calculate the sagittal height, but the best thing of course is to measure it. Even with a corneal topographer you should be able to do that. And then if you know if you have a normal eye, and the normal eye should be somewhere between 3,550 and 3,950 or 4,000, somewhere in that range. If you have a standard lens, why bother by going to a custom-made lens? The lenses that we have today of all these manufacturers of disposable lenses, they're the best lenses we ever had in history. We have different materials, we have lenses that we can dispose of on a daily basis even. It's not going to get much better than that. So in that category of the normal eye, we gotta be straight to ourselves and the patient and say, listen, let's use one of these beautiful stock lenses that we have. Now the problem with that is within that category there's only limited space of about 275 microns between lens A and lens B, base curve 1 and base curve 2. So we don't have a lot of room to play with. So yes, if we're in the top of the bell curve it's fine, but on the left, on the right, remember the total range of ocular surfaces is about 900 microns and our diversity variance here is about 275. And we think, and we as myself, Lyndon Jones and James Wolfson, based on that article that I just mentioned and also a session that we did early this year at the Global Specialty Lens Symposium, that if you have a normal eye, the opportunities that you have to better fit a lens with the given lens that we have is limited. So it's much better to look at other variables that are probably more important than just the lens fit. So everybody who knows me, I like to think in lens fit and how important it is. But if you have a standard eye, you're probably better off looking at material. Replacement frequency is certainly one of the things to look at. Daily disposables is a very good option in general. And a number of other things. So the ones here listed in, it's a little bit off topic, I don't have the time to discuss all this, but there are a couple of evidence-based things that you can look at with the light blue, and a couple of that there's basically no evidence for, the dark blue area. But what I do want to say is that the ones in the light blue are probably more important than lens fit per se. So material, replacement, and even solutions used. Think the multi-purpose solution that you're using, maybe hydrogen peroxide. All these things are probably more important within that normal category than lens fit per se. And we think, and this is based on calculations by Phil Morgan and some of our own calculations, that if we do this right, we could reduce the dropout rate by about 3 or 4%. And if we could do that between now and 2040, so 20 years from now, we may as much as double the amount of wearers in our contact lens practice. So that is sort of that left side of the flow chart here. We call it the dropout control panel even. Within that normal eye, look at replacement, look at material, lens care, and then a little bit lens design. But in that order probably. And then if we don't have a normal eye, we're gonna move to the other side. So on the left side, we gotta think inside the box. Literally almost inside a box of maybe 30 lenses if you want to go for daily disposables. If you go to the right side of the chart and we're looking at unique eyes, so the ones on the left and the right side of that bell curve, then we gotta start thinking outside of the box. And then we gotta start really thinking about lenses that are custom made or maybe that have extended parameters. So let's take a look at that last category first, out of standard lenses. So they typically have a fixed geometry, but they have base curves and diameters in different variations. So they are typically manufactured individually, lathe cut, but we have options. We have optical options, but also lens design options. And here we're really trying to match, like this banana holder, to match some kind of natural tissue with a piece of plastic. And what we've seen from our studies and from other studies as well is that a better way of looking at that is not doing, if you look at the correlation between base curve and sagittal height, it's not very high. If you look at the correlation between diameter and sagittal height, it's much better, it's 0.8. So if base curve is certainly not the best way of doing this, looking at diameter is probably a better way to go. And then using sagittal height, if we had the sagittal height of all of the lenses that were fitting, that probably is the best way go forward. So this is sort of an ideal situation, like a wet dream to us contact lens freaks like myself. This is a trial set of 8 lenses, 200 micron increments, and you can see the little steps and what that does with that Optimec instrument used in our study as well. And if I go from one lens to the next one, in this one, I know exactly 200 microns is all the changes that I'm going to make, because the material is the same, design is the same, diameter is the same, etc., etc. So here I can really make a difference as a contact lens specialist. Now here's another company working with something like that, and look at the options that we have. That is surely extended parameters. This is a company that happens to be active in Europe a lot, and I think in South America as well. And what they do is they actually list all of their lens options in sagittal height. So if you go from one lens and you think, oh, that is really not my lens, it needs to go much steeper or flatter or whatever, the next lens you can choose by just looking at 200 or 300 micron steps or whatever you want to do. And then there's the last category. These are really beautiful custom-made lenses. They're made truly individual for that particular eye, and they're tailor-made. It's like going to Italy, to Napoli to get a suit tailor-made for you. There's literally no limits. And you think this may be a little bit of science fiction, but it's not, because it's out there. Companies are doing it. This is a University of Liverpool in the UK. What they do is they take the image of a profilometry map, they digitalize that. This happens to be my eye, I think my right eye. Digitalize that, and you can use that to send that information to a lathe that can simply make a lens for you. It's not that far off. And there's another company, this one happens to be from the Netherlands, although I have no strings attached to that company, but I admire what they're doing, is that they're taking the corneal topography, extend that out, and sort of calculate the optimal lens for that eye. And with that, they have this model, as you can see right here, where they can sort of measure or at least calculate the tension underneath that soft lens in the periphery. That's your delta sag. That's your edge strain right there. And depending on what you want, you can increase or decrease the strain you're putting on that peripheral eye. So how cool is that? And so it's not science fiction, it's right here. We can use that if we want. It should be available to many of us now or in the near future. So I think that's the state of the art of soft lens fitting. And the state of the art of soft lens fitting is really going the artificial intelligence way. I think we could really use artificial intelligence. What a couple of companies are doing now is they have a database of tens of thousands of eyes. And if you come in with a topography of that eye that you want to fit, they see where that matches in, whether it's a normal eye or not, or it's one of these out of standard eyes. And they immediately tell you, go for a standard lens, it's perfect, or it should fit, or hang on, careful, because this is an out of standard eye, you probably want to go with one of our custom lens design or extended parameter lens ones. So when it comes to finding Nemos, we shouldn't be afraid of that. It's rather the opposite. We should embrace it, and we should use that to our advantage to first define what the normal eye is, or whether it is a normal eye, and then second, if it's not, to use that to create better lenses than we have. Have been calling that survival of the fitting. And if we want to do that, we need to elevate soft lens fitting. And I mean that quite literally. In terms of microns, we need to elevate it to the next level. And I've written a couple of things about that. Certainly about saying goodbye to base curve as a go-to parameter to fit soft lenses, because if we do that, we're not going to get anywhere. So cheers, old chap, we had a jolly good time, but now it's time to move on. And on one of my last visits to beautiful Latin America, this was in between I think Argentina and Chile, I came across that sign. It said Termino Zona de Curva, and I thought, that's it. It's the end of the era of curves. We need to move on, at least when it comes to soft lens fitting, but it's true for scleral lenses to a large degree, ortho K as well. So I think curves had their best time. And actually curves, when it comes to soft lens fitting, we inherited that from thinking of hard lenses. It should have never been base curves. And during the Corona time, I wrote a couple of columns on LinkedIn, if you want to look them up. And one of them was about flattening the curve. And when I'm a little bit of a contact lens freak, as I said earlier. When I hear that term, flattening the curve, I immediately start thinking contact lenses. But even in Corona times or COVID times, when we started thinking about lowering that curve or that sagittal height, that graph basically, to stay under a certain critical level where our hospitals could handle it or not, it wasn't about flattening the curve. Like in contact lenses, it was about lowering the sagittal height of that graph to a maximum height where we could handle it or not. So again, call me a freak if you want. You have my permission, but that is what that's about. In essence, what I'm trying to say is that, and I've called this the inconvenient truth about soft lens fitting in the past. We need to come up with better ways to start fitting soft lenses, otherwise it may and will become a commodity, something that you sell over the shelf in any shop, but not linked to our contact lens practices per se. And another column in that line was 3 chords and the truth. It was about that, the inconvenient truth about soft lens fitting. And that one actually got translated with kind permission of and kind help of Contamac into Spanish as well. So that would be available on the CLASS2020 Facebook site, a series of those. But this was one of them on that particular topic. So I'm going to finish it off. And I'm going to finish it up with this. I think the last 10 years, the last decade, so between 10 and 20, for me at least, was the decade of scleral lenses. I mean, a lot of things happened in that decade. About 10 years ago, scleral lens guide I wrote, and since then, things have changed in the contact lens business, not because of the book, but just to mark that time period. And the 10 years before that, for me at least, was the 10 years or the decade of ortho K. Between 2000 and 2010, the first serious publications on ortho K came out. And so we have, since the turn of the millennium, we had those 2 decades. And my hope and proposition is that the next maybe 10 years, decade, will be the decade of soft lenses, of soft specialty lenses. And I've written a column about that in my newsletter, which is, by the way, kindly supported by an educational grant from Contimec as well. softspecialedition.com if you want to sign up for that. It's free, and I try to summarize what comes out on soft lenses, soft specialty lenses, from a scientific and educational standpoint. But my column is that maybe the next 10 years it's time to look at soft lenses in more depth. So with that, I'm going to finish off this presentation and hand it back over, if it was a real conference, to the CLASS 2020 people and team. Thank you, Carlos. Thank you, Contimec, for organizing this, for spreading the word on specialty lenses, and in this particular case, spreading the word on soft specialty lenses. Particularly, it's a special year, 2020. This is the perfect time to start soft lens fitting 2.0. And Otto Witterli, of course, unfortunately he passed away, but he'll be looking down upon, and he would smile if he see that sagittal heights 50 years down the line are back on the agenda again of CLASS 2020. Thank you very much.